Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
How often do you monitor your overhead? How often do you look at it? How often do you check the various categories? Maybe you've downloaded one of those overhead sheets we've offered up in prior episodes. Maybe you've even filled it out. Let's say you filled it out 6 months ago. Have you looked at it since, or did you just look at it then and go, it's $60,000 a month, and that was that? If you're like the average practice owner, dentist, probably not very frequent. As a matter of fact, what I find when I meet with a newer client is that usually their overhead management consists of looking at a P&L maybe once a quarter given to them by their accountant. Now, I'm not finding fault in this approach, but that approach no longer works. That approach worked prior to May of 2021. You could actually even say prior to March of 2020, but really prior to May of 2021, not paying a ton of attention to your overhead and expenses worked. Why? Well, in May of 2021, we had our first big spike in inflation. Inflation was up by 5% year over year. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. And look, I know you might find some of these numbers boring. I have a lot of new information to give you here on this, but this is something I can't stress the urgency with which, you need to know this information. This is something you have to know, because if you don't know it, it can adversely affect you, your practice, your team. This is something that you need to pay attention to if you own a practice, folks. Okay. But in May of 2021, inflation was 5% year over year. Okay. That was the first big spike. In the 10 years prior, if you looked at it, all right, it was, 1%, 2%. Sometimes it was minus 1.7%. As a matter of fact, the highest inflation percentage prior to May of 2021, for the 10 years prior to May of 2021, was 2.9% in June and July of either 2018 or 19. That was the big high, 2.9. Okay. So it started at 5 in May of 2021. It peaked middle of last year over 9%. So expenses are going up. So if you are not regularly monitoring your expenses, again, prior to 2021, you're looking at it once in a while, fine, because inflation isn't that bad. But now with it going the way that it's been going, if you're not monitoring these things regularly, you're going to find out all of a sudden you're left behind. And unfortunately, it's one of these things that if you don't look at it for 6 to 8 months, a lot has changed during that period. So for this week's episode, I want to focus on what should you be doing in the face of all this? How can you, despite all this, the inflationary pressures, the higher salaries, all of this kind of stuff, and a growing office, how can you maintain your profitability, control your overhead, and continue to be successful despite all this? My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And I want to start off with a little bit of a primer on all this, because there's and by primer, I mean a little bit of a basics on this. Some folks may know this, but for the most part, when we hear the term inflation, what does that mean? It means prices are going up. It means more than that, but essentially that's what it means. Something that cost us $1 now costs us $1.10, right? If anything costs $1 anymore. As a matter of fact, I think the dollar store it's the $2 store now, right? Anyway, but something that cost us $1 now costs us more. That's inflation. Simple. But how do we get this number? Where does this number come from? Well, it comes from something called the Consumer Price Index. You've probably heard this term before, CPI, which is put out by the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Okay, and I'll even put some charts for you to refer back to when you look at this. So we get this Consumer Price Index. What is the Consumer Price Index? Well, essentially, it is a basket, meaning a group of different categories and how much those categories have inflated over a set period of time. And the two numbers you'll normally hear, you'll hear month to month and you'll hear year over year. All right. Now, look, again, this isn't an economics podcast. I'm not a stockbroker. I'm not giving you economic advice. I'm just giving you some basics because this is something you have to know as a business owner. Okay. So that month-to-month number is usually really small. You'll hear inflation was up by 0.4% or inflation was up by 0%. That means that if something cost $1, if it was up by 0.4 or less than 1%, something that cost $1 last month costs $1.50 the next month. It's month to month. The bigger number that you hear is year over year. So if something cost me $1 in April of 2021 and inflation in April of 2022 is 5%, so $1 in 2021, it's now going to be $1.05 in April of 22. That's year over year. So the number we got last month, for example, meaning March of 2023, was 5%. So this means that what cost us $1 in March of 2022 now cost us $1.05 in March of 2023. That's the year over year number. Okay. Now, what is this group of things in this CPI basket? Well, here's the basic categories. Again, you might wonder, why are you doing this, Jeff? This is important, folks. Food, and that breaks down, food at home, food at a restaurant. Okay, but food, energy, gas, electricity, etc. Apparel, clothes, new vehicles, shelter, rent and mortgage, medical care services, you fit into that, and education and communication. All right. You don't have to, there's no test on this, folks, but you with me so far. So we got, food, energy, apparel, cars, shelter, medical, and education. Those are our different categories. So you get this big overall number, which is a combination of all these categories when you say that inflation went up. And then each of these categories inflate differently. Okay. So, you might see gas is a lot more expensive than it was a few years ago. That went up by, multiple percentages, right? But anyway, you get the idea. So you got this overall number, which is sort of an average, and then you get the individual category numbers. All right. So here's where things get interesting. First thing is this. So, you take a look at, we're having a victory lap because inflation's going down in March of 2023 to 5%. It's the big deal because, it was 9% in June of last year. That's horrible. Okay. So we're all happy about that. But what does that actually mean? This is where, I was telling my assistant, this is where you get a bit of a head fake with inflation. Of course, she asked what a head fake was because she's not a big sports fan, but you get the idea. Head fake. People who are sports fans know what I'm talking about. If you're not, if you have somebody running and they kind of fake they're going to go one way and they really go the other, it's a head fake. You get a bit of a head fake with inflation on this. Hopefully I didn't just lose everybody with the head fake reference. Anyway, so what that means is, or what I mean by that is we go, okay, inflation's going down. It's only 5%. But how does that play out when you're in a inflationary environment that's been going on for an extended period of time? Let me demonstrate this to you. So I want you to think with this for a second. And again, I'm not a fan of putting numbers on the podcast, but I have to. And I'll put the charts up from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. I'll put it on the episode webpage. You can download it. So if something cost me $1 in March of 2020, cost me $1 in March 2020. Well, the year-over-year inflation in March of 2021 was 3% approximately. You track with this so far? So it cost me $1 in March of 2020. Now, in March of 2021, it's going to cost me $1.03. Oh, but we had inflation of March of 2022 and inflation of March of 2023, right? So let's walk this forward. This is the thing nobody thinks with. They're thinking with this basic number of 1 being $1 and inflation going up and down, but it compounds on itself, okay? So here, something that cost you $1 in March of 2020 cost you, I'm using the real numbers, this is from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, would have cost you $1.03 in March of 2021, $1.11 in March of 2022, and $1.17 in March of 2023. So the inflation since March of 2020, generally, if you combine all those categories, is 16.89%. Let that ring in your brain for a minute. So inflation from March of 2020 through to March of 2023 is almost 17%. So let's say you have a dental assistant and you're paying this dental assistant $18 an hour. For that dental assistant, for he or she to just tread water and pay for their basic expenses, their salary would have to go from $18 to $21. It would have to go up by 17%. You see where I'm going with this? It's not just, 5%. All that really means in my mind, and maybe I'm being, maybe this is a Gen X thing, folks. I don't know. But, we could sit here and go, oh, yay, inflation's only 5%. That doesn't negate all the prior inflation, number one. But that's sort of like saying, yeah, my boat's, taking on water. It's just doing it less fast now. Okay? So that's really what the scene is, but that is the average of everything. But let's dig into these categories a little bit deeper, folks, because this is where it gets really interesting. And maybe, look, you might click off at this point. I don't want to hear this number stuff, economic stuff. If you want a business, you need to listen to this, okay? Because this doesn't just affect you and your business. This affects every vendor you're dealing with and their employees, and this affects your employees, okay? And your ability to field a decent team and afford a decent team going forward. So now, let's dig into these categories a little bit deeper. Let's start with the categories where prices haven't changed all that much since March of 20. So we have new vehicles. I mean, those have gone up at various points and have gone down. And a lot of that had to do with supply. If you remember at one point, there was all the supply chain stuff. See, we forgot about that stuff, didn't we? It's been only a year and a half, 2 years. If you remember all that supply chain stuff, you had issues where you had, 2,000 cars sitting in Ford's assembly, post-assembly lot with no chips. You had stuff like this. So obviously when you have less of something, it's going to become more expensive, right? So car prices went up for a bit. Then they went down, and things got a little wonky, but overall, not a huge price change since March 2020. What other categories haven't changed much? Apparel. There you're seeing, 2-3% or a negative percent year over year. Apparel hasn't changed that much. It has gone up in price, but it's not, drastic. And then the other two categories that haven't changed much are medical care services, i.e., that includes you, and education and communication. Whatever that means. I know the education part, communication, I'm not completely familiar with, full disclosure. I didn't dig into this that hard. So that's what hasn't changed all that much. That's where you're seeing, like in healthcare, you'll see a 3.2%, 2.9%, 1.7%, all while the overall percentages, 7, 8, etc. What has changed drastically? So we know overall, right? Now keep in mind, if overall prices have gone up in 3 years by almost 17%, they were going up at, they went up 5% year over year last month, and June of 2022 was up 9.1. That's the average, folks, right? So if these other numbers are low, what categories have gone up high? I mean, you know them already. You're dealing with them daily. Food, gas, electricity, and shelter. Those are the ones that have gone up a lot. So let's walk that forward. I went over the general numbers with you. Something that cost you $1 cost you $1.17, or $1 in 2020 rather. March of 2020 cost you $1.17 in March of 2023. How about food? Overall with food, if something you'd spend $1 on in March of 2020, I'm not going to go through all of the years. Let me just go from 2020 to 2023. But something that cost you $1 in March of 2020 cost you $1.22 in March of 2023. That's 22% inflation. Remember, our general inflation was almost 17%, so 22% for food. How about gasoline? Dollars worth of gas in March of 2020 cost you $1.49 in March of 2023. That's almost 50%. I mean, as of that, at one point it was even higher, if you remember. How about electricity? $1 worth of electricity in March of 2020 cost you $1.27.5 in March of 2023. Here we have a 27.46% increase. And shelter, rent, mortgage, etc., $1 in March of 2020 now costs you $1.15.5. That's a 15.5% increase. So we have food's gone up by 22%, gas has gone up by almost 50%, electricity's gone up by 27.5%, and shelter's gone up by 15.5%. If you average those four major categories, that's 26.33%. Sorry for the numbers, folks. But now, the reason I bring this up is you go, okay, let's take that dental assistant again, who we were paying $18 an hour in March of 2020. And maybe we haven't, increased the wages so much since then. Well, all right, where are they going to be spending most of their money? Food, gas, electricity, and shelter. If they need a new car, new vehicles comes into play. Education, I mean, maybe there's a CE course they can't do or have to make a decision about. Medical care services, they probably have healthcare insurance or health insurance, and their dentistry is probably free because they work for you. And, apparel. Maybe they don't buy those gray goose shoes this month. You get what I'm saying, in other words. The things that people buy all the time and every day have increased a lot. The things that are more elective purchases in some cases have increased a lot less. So that puts additional pressure on your employees and your practice. So remember, this is happening to your employees. It's happening to you. It's happening to the employees of every vendor that you deal with as well. Your lab, Patterson, Shine, DC Dental, the different suppliers, the implant company you deal with. All of those pressures are on their employees as well, which means they in turn either have to increase wages or they're going to be facing, people not able to afford to work at their office. And so then they have to in turn increase prices. So you're seeing it with an increase in prices by various category. We're seeing it with our clients. I'm seeing overheads for clients that should have been around 85,000 all of a sudden at, 100,000. Right? So expenses are going up. And I wanted to bring up, I didn't want to just throw a bunch of numbers at you, but I wanted to throw out the compounding idea of inflation because I don't think people think with that. They look at a number, an isolated number. Ooh, 5% is better than 9%. Yeah, but it's 5% from last year. And at that time, it was 8% from the prior year. It's not like all of a sudden that thing that cost me $1 in March of 2020, because inflation's only 5%, it's now $1.05. No, because there's the prior years of inflation that are all baked in. And I don't think people look at that. All right. So even if it's, let's say March of next year, it's 4%, woohoo. All right. Well, that means that things cost $1.20. We've had over a 20% increase since March of 2020. You get the idea. I don't think I have to bang on this that much harder, but this is important to know, because that means your expenses in turn have probably gone up similarly in your practice. And what's the one expense that you don't adjust for inflation? Profit, because that's, with what you're left over with at the end. So who's the one taking the big hit? And, I don't see, and, look, again, I'm not an economist, but, with the way that companies are set up and governments are set up and the way that we're all set up, it's all debt-based, meaning deflation, where prices start to go down, we may think of initially as really good, right? Oh, that's really great. Prices are going down. Usually that's not how things work in the long term. Because again, if I've had something that cost me $1 in March of 2020 and it's now $1.17 in March of 2023, it's not like all of a sudden if next year inflation is 0 that the prices went back to $1. It's still $1.17. Okay. And you might think when prices start to drop, that's good. And I agree. But part of the problem is okay, if you go eggs were $10 a dozen, now they're $5 a dozen. Well, cool. But I'm paying $5 for those eggs. But the problem was, it's not like the staff are taking pay cuts. Maybe the grocers or the grocery store owner or the grocery store chain manager is having to lay off employees at that point. So their revenues are going down as a result of me paying less for those goods and services, right? Well, that's going to eventually affect who those employees were buying things from because they have less money or they're unemployed. It starts to spread around. You see? And the problem with that, it's really not a big deal in the long term. If we're just making less, but we're spending less for things, that all sounds good. The problem is that grocer took out all kinds of debt to open up an additional produce branch and has a business line of credit that they have to service, but they're taking in less revenue now. Okay? So get the idea. We're paying less for groceries. Grocers making less money. They can't service their debt anymore. They're in trouble. Okay, now imagine that grocery store is the government. Okay, so now you get the idea. We're not going to have sustained price drops for any period of time because from a banking and a debt and a government perspective, that doesn't work. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. Don't get me wrong. I have pretty basic beliefs with regards to economics. It's just usually not how things work. There always has to be some degree of inflation the way that things are currently set up. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with it, but it is what it is. So if you're not baking this into your current business model and figuring out how to work around it or through it, because again, what is the category that is inflated? One of the lowest inflation categories the last 3 years has been healthcare. Okay. So if you're doing that throughout all this, meanwhile, you have employees you have to afford and your vendors have employees they have to afford, you are going to get into trouble. All right. So I guess that's why I started off saying this is urgent. There's the train. There's the light on the train. You're standing on the train tracks. It's still pretty far away. You can hear the whistling, but I'm asking you, jump off the tracks. Okay. Put yourself in a position or at least be able to outpace the train going the other way. So let's take a look at what would you do in a situation like this. So your prices are going up and you want to be able to, and your practice is growing, which is great. How do you maintain this profitability? Well, there's 5 basic things you're going to want to do. Number 1. So I want to talk to you about you've heard the term, or you're familiar with the term, a hat, a hat that you wear, right? We talk about this, the different jobs that you have. Well, I've covered before that a dental practice owner has the job of, they're the dentist, obviously. You also have the sales job. That is your job. You're also the business owner or executive by default, whether you like it or not. One of those executive jobs is your CFO job, chief financial officer. Sure, you're not a huge Fortune 500 company. That doesn't mean that function can go unfulfilled. This is your job, whether you like it or not. And there's a clear differentiation between a CFO and a bookkeeper. If I have a bookkeeper, their job is to, pay my bills, reconcile my checkbook, keep my Quicken up to date or QuickBooks up to date, make sure everything's ready for the accountant, etc. Okay, that's fine. And that's a valuable, function in a business, but they're not the one making financial decisions. That's the wrong place to put those decisions. Those go to you. And you could sit there and go, oh, I hate numbers and blah, blah. Tough, okay? Tough. You have to be able to at least handle them and understand them. You have to wear this hat. This is an executive position. If you look at the CFO's job is to have a financially sound, profitable, and expanding business. From a financial perspective, that is the outcome you're supposed to be getting. So you have to be willing to at least wear that hat, okay? I mean, that's one of the things we teach our clients very early on because financial control is half the equation. You could make a gazillion dollars, but if you're spending it all, you're left with nothing. So you have to be able to control your expenses as well as do things for the practice to make sure you're making more money. Because a lot of people focus on this, the financial management is all about expense. It's not just all about expense. It's also about controlling income. Okay. And income sources and making sure that you're investing in things that are going to actually make the practice make more money. For instance, let's take a look at something. If you as a consumer go to a supermarket and you buy a head of lettuce, okay, a head of iceberg lettuce, you get to, well, first it's $1 billion now. No, I'm kidding. And you buy a head of iceberg lettuce, you go to the counter, you put it on the counter, and then all of a sudden you notice the bottom is brown and wet. It's rotting. Are you going to pay for that iceberg lettuce? No. They're not going to say, well, you grabbed it off the produce shelf, you have to pay. Of course you're not. You're going to put it back or maybe go get another head of lettuce. That consumer viewpoint is not a bad viewpoint to have from the CFO perspective, but with all the expenses that you're making. So I have an employee. I'm paying them X amount of dollars. I have a certain outcome that I'm expecting. Well, it doesn't mean I can't pay them, but why would I continue to employ somebody if they're not doing what I'm expecting them to do? I think I could maybe do better. Or without at least having a conversation and going, hey, you need to up your level of performance here because this isn't working for me, because you're allocating that salary for that person to get a certain job done. If they're not getting the job done, you need to get somebody who will. Again, I'm not advocating that you don't pay people, just so we're clear. But you have to do that. But I wouldn't continue to employ someone if I'm paying and I'm not getting what I'm expected to get in return. And that's assuming I've done everything I'm supposed to do to train them and so on. So that's the first thing. You have to wear this CFO hat. It is your hat as the owner of the business. You cannot escape from it. It is yours. We can teach you how to do it. It's not a problem, but this is something that you have to wear. Okay, so you got this inflation going on. Maybe your office is expanding. Expenses are going up. And this is another little interesting caveat. When a business is expanding, it's sometimes tougher to find out that you have potentially brewing financial problems. Because if you have an office that's collecting $400,000 or $500,000 a month, it can take more hits than an office that's collecting 50. There's more money coming in. So it can take more of a hit. It has more resources. It has bigger lines of credit. It has more cash in the bank. So it goes through a couple of months and, it's not that big of a deal that things were down. But it takes longer to catch up, but eventually it does catch up, and it's more catastrophic when it catches up versus in a smaller environment. Because if I have an office doing 50 and I have had 2-3 bad months, yeah, it's bad, but it's also not hard to turn it around versus turning around $500,000 or $600,000 office might take a little bit longer. So this is something you're going to want to monitor, especially as you grow, because it's very easy as you add more and more personnel for things to spin out of control expense-wise. So then let's take a look at the front end for a second. So if I'm looking at managing profitability and overhead, the first place I'm actually going to look, I've got my CFO hat on, is actually at income. That's the first place that I look. And you might go, well, Jeff, that's counterintuitive. Shouldn't we manage expenses first? Yes, we should manage expenses, but usually I'm going to look at income first, because if I'm not making any money, managing my expenses are going to be kind of a waste of time anyway. I have to make sure that there's a steady flow of revenue coming into the business. So I want to make sure I have no lost opportunities. I want to make sure that I'm not wasting opportunities. Now, if I want to increase my income, there's a few things that I'd have to do. One, I would have to make sure I have a steady flow of patients, that would be patients of record and recall coming in, and I have a steady flow of new patients coming in. We talk about how to do that at the MG New Patient Workshop. It's my shameless plug. I'll have a couple this episode. But I have to make sure I'm getting a steady flow of patients coming in. I have to make sure that I can actually sell. Because if I can't sell, it really doesn't matter. You can get a ton of new patients coming in, and if I'm only capitalizing on 10 to 20% of those opportunities, it's a real wasted resource. It's sort of like, not that I'm trying to compare patients to a food, okay? But it'd be almost like ordering a pie, taking a bite, and throwing the pie away. So you're driving in 100 new patients a month, and you're only closing, maybe 5 or 10. It's a bit of a waste, or you're only closing them for, a third or a quarter of their full treatment plan. You're losing opportunities right then and there. So you have to make sure that you're maximizing your opportunities. So we have sales and marketing are the basics there. Some other things that are just unique to the current environment, which I don't want to spend too long on, but these are important. Again, urgency, folks, is so we've had 17% overall inflation since March of 2020. We've had other categories like food and gas or whatever that have gone up even more. And then healthcare costs have hardly gone up at all. That includes you. So if I have all these expenses going up around me, I have to raise my fees. And I know you've heard me say this before. I guess, my question for you would be, if someone goes, yeah, Jeff, you talked about this before, is have you raised your fees? Because if you haven't, with these numbers going the way that they are, you're going to get into trouble. So you have to make sure your fees are tracking. And that becomes a little bit of a trick here. So I'm just going to give you a real basic on this. The first aspect of it is you have to make sure that what you are charging is in line with what you should be charging your zip code. I've talked about the Wasserman Guide before. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. It's a bit backwards technologically, but I love it, maybe because I'm old school, and it's extremely complete. Whoever puts this together, I'm not affiliated with them in any way, does a really excellent job. But they take a look at what fees by what your CDT codes, all the CDT codes, they look at your zip code and what the fees are by by percentile. So in other words, if I look at this sheet, let's say I'm looking at code 2740, it'll say the 30th percentile fee in your zip code is 800, 40th is 950, 50th is 1050. All that means is if I'm in the 50th percentile, it means that half the doctors in town charge the same or less, and half charge the same or more. If I'm in the 30th percentile, it means that 30% of the doctors in town charge that amount or less. Okay? So you want to be most likely in the 60th or 70th percentile. So I would definitely recommend that you start looking at this with your fees. And again, it didn't matter that much over the last 10 years or so, or prior to 2021, because inflation was kind of a non-factor. Now it's more of a factor. So you have to make sure that your fees are keeping pace. But, and this is the big but, I don't know if the Wasserman Guide has been adjusted for inflation for the last year. It probably takes a long time to put these guides together. You think about all those CDT codes for every zip code in the United States. That's quite a long time. Okay. So I don't know that they're adjusting it for this inflationary pressure that's going on. So you might have to look at it and go, okay, let's say you're charging for 2740, you're charging, $950. That's your normal fee. All right. And then you look at the Wasserman Guide, and that puts you in the 30th percentile, and you want to move up to the 60th, which is, $1150. Okay, so you raise that fee to $1150. But that may not be adjusted for the 7 or 8% increase in prices nationally since last year. So you might have to go to $1150 plus, 6 or 7%. So it might be $1,200. So this is something you need to look at as you're doing this, but you have to charge a normal fee. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep up with all the other price increases going on in your office. And I know I've said this before, but again, I hope these numbers are driving this home a little bit harder. Which brings me to the next point. And, maybe I should just rename the podcast Get Out of PPO's podcast, right? You have to get out of managed care. Because again, if my fees are being artificially suppressed to $700 or $800 for 2740 and the 30th percentile is $950, I'm going to go broke. I'm working for the insurance company. So what's the alternative? The alternative is, you may lose some of those patients. And I have a whole episode on how to get out of PPOs. We did it, I think it was about 6-7 episodes ago. You can check it out. I would definitely recommend that you do. But if I don't change something and I keep charging that, $800 or $850 for this code while all my other prices are going up, my lab's increasing in price and everything else, I'm going to end up not being able to compete or pay my staff. I'm eventually, don't be surprised if that dental assistant goes and gets a job across town because they're paying $7 more an hour. And there's already a shortage of staff to begin with. I'm not trying to create I have to give all my staff raises right away. You want to at least make sure what you're paying is in line with what you should be paying because they're facing the same pressures you are. Now you might go, well, I don't have the money for that. Well, that might be because you're undercharging for all your services. Do you see? And it's not just staff, it's other stuff too. And you know who else it's for? It's for you. It's also not okay for you to go to school, get a doctorate, open up a business, support a whole team, and not get paid. You should actually be getting paid for what you're doing, and you should be getting paid what you're worth. So you need to get out of the PPOs because if you don't, your fees are being artificially suppressed and you can't affect an increase in fees. So you're going to have to inflate. You're going to have to learn how to sell. You're going to learn how to market because the alternative, if you take a look, if you drop PPOs, you're going to lose some patients. But why get in PPOs in the first place? It's because you couldn't attract the new patients at will that you wanted to attract. So just learn how to do that. It's really not that difficult, folks. It's business 101. We can teach you how to do this. All right, so that's point number 2. You need to wear your CFO hat. Point number 2 is you need to raise your fees, learn to sell better, and get more new patients. Point number 3, you're going to have to manage your expenses more closely now than you were maybe 3-4 years ago. You got to look regularly. Now, how often would I look? Would I look like every month? I might be doing more of a random check, meaning, maybe you have that phone, the recording software on your phone. It's not really a software. It's usually a site that records calls, and you listen to calls at random. Same thing here. In other words, I might look at my P&L once a month and I'll go, okay, show me the supply bill, break down a couple prices for me. What are we paying for this? What are we paying for composite material? What are we paying for that? What are we paying for this? If I see these categories start to jump a bit, all right? I also want a good command of what my basic overhead is in order to do this. So I'm going to give you 2 things. We've offered these before, but I'll offer them again. We have an overhead sheet, it's a nice digital overhead sheet. It's very complete to work out what the expenses are in your practice. The download's on the episode webpage. We also have an overhead percentage by category, which tells you what you should be spending for each category, rent, supplies, etc. You can download that as well. So if I see my supplies going up over that 7% that they should not exceed, I'm going to want to find out why. Maybe because of a major purchase, we had to buy a new whatever, or it may be because prices are going up and I'm not keeping pace with my revenues, all right? So you're going to want to look at this stuff regularly. And this is why when you don't raise your fees or you're in a lot of managed care, it starts to mess you up because that lab fee is going up no matter what. Regardless of the fact that the patient's in a PPO and you're only getting $600 for it, you're still paying the same amount as you're paying doing it on me at full fee. Okay? Okay, that's number 3. So you're going to manage your expenses more closely and more frequently. What's point number 4? You're going to have to get the most out of what you are spending your money on. You need to eliminate waste, use what you have. So if I'm paying for something, I have to use it. If I'm employing somebody, they have to get the expected result. If I hire somebody to do reactivation and they're not scheduling anybody, that can't stand. They have to do reactivation. People have to deliver, the expected deliverable for what you're paying for these deliverables, guys. Think about this. If you hire me as a scheduler, you're hiring me to keep your appointment book booked, productive, booked efficiently, booked the way you want it booked, primary procedures in the morning. That's why I'm there. So if I come in and your schedule's empty half the time and you're doing 6 crown preps at 7 o'clock at night, I'm not doing what you hired me for. You're paying me for that. That's the whole point. Do you see? And I think sometimes we don't think that way. Sure, I'm part of the team and there's that camaraderie and everything else, but I'm also supposed to fulfill a specific function. If I'm not fulfilling that function, I either need to start doing that or you need to get somebody that will. All right? Which brings back to another point. We've got this increase in prices, and I think, at least this has happened to me. It's happened to other people that I've known. We tend to get things fixed in our mind a certain way, and it doesn't necessarily evolve with the passage of time. If you're over 40 and you think of making $100,000 a year, you might think, okay, that's not bad, right? That's pretty good. That's actually a really nice salary. Now versus 20 years, it's a whole different ballgame. Making $100,000 a year now versus back in 2004, that's a whole different ballgame. It does not buy as much, but that number got embedded in your head when you were a kid. That's how things work. Well, that can happen to you a little bit when you start hiring. As a matter of fact, Sabrina was just telling me a story. She was talking to a client who couldn't find, they were looking for administrative employees. They were having some trouble. So she asked how much she was advertising for, because she was advertising for, I think it was $12 an hour, right, for an entry-level position. Well, yeah, $15 or $16 an hour is the new $12 an hour, folks. How 40 is the new 50 or 50 is the new 40, right? Well, no, the $16, $15 an hour is the entry level pay now. I mean, it may vary on the area. It might be higher, it might be lower, but that's the average. I mean, if you look at entry level at fast food, Chipotle, a lot of these folks are paying 15 to start. Okay. And I'm not saying, but those are entry level positions. It's like the first job that you get. So if you're looking for somebody who's entry level and you're advertising for $12, you may not get who you're looking to get. This client was also advertising for 15, 16 an hour for, more skilled positions, but those positions have also gone up in what they're demanding. Those are now 18 to 20 or $21 an hour positions. It's evolving because the people you're hiring and the people you employ are facing the same economic pressures that you are. That's the point. So that's number 4. You got to get the most out of what you're spending your money on. And lastly, you're going to have to manage what you spend your money on wisely. So again, we're taking this sort of consumer viewpoint when we're buying things, right? I've hired someone to do scheduling. I'm expecting a full schedule. Of course, I have to train them and they're part of the team, etc., but I'm expecting a deliverable, right? Well, the same thing applies to anything that you buy for your office. You're going to go out and buy a laser and high-tech imaging and this and that and whatever. Before I go doing all that, I'd look at do you actually need it? Can you sell it? Can you sell it? You bought a cone beam because you want to do implants. Well, how many implants do you do a month? Can you sell implants? If you have trouble doing those things, you're going to buy a bunch of equipment, which is going to suck out of your overhead. And then you're not going to be able to, it's just going to be an additional expense. You're not going to find the revenue to meet that additional expense that you're incurring. I've talked about this before. We saw this with the CEREC machines when they came out. You'd have people ordering CERECs who were doing 3 or 4 crowns a month. Why? The lease payment was $1,600. Why buy a CEREC? You could just use your lab. It's cheaper. But, the idea was, I'm going to have a CEREC and patients are going to go, oh, wow, I want same-day crowns. And maybe it wasn't as big of a selling point as you thought. So the point being is if I'm going to buy a piece of equipment, I'm going to buy anything, it has to actually have a return on investment. I guess that would be the best way of saying it. Anything you spend money on right now has to have a return or at least a potential return that makes sense. So we got those 5 things. You got to wear your CFO hat. You need to inflate your fees to match inflation. You're going to have to manage your expenses more closely. You're going to have to get the most of what you're spending the money on, and you're going to have to spend your money wisely, especially with major purchases. All right, those are the 5 things we do to combat this. Anyway, I hope that helps. Sorry it was a little bit more informal. I just wanted to come in there and really stress the urgency of all of this. If you're looking at what's going on in your office and you go, I don't even know where to start, what do I do? Here's my suggestion. We offer a free practice consultation where we can focus on things like overhead and expense. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. You just fill out your info. You pick a time that's good for you. And we can do that with you and start you on the right path to putting this under some degree of control. I also have the downloads on the episode webpage for the overhead sheet and the overhead by percentage, by category. I also have a link to those statistics I was talking about, those CPI statistics, where you can kind of expand it and break it down by category. Again, folks, that's all I have for you this week. Have a great week, and we will see you the next episode.